Hi, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 debate, the show where we're asking, as the UK faces an unprecedented public health crisis, well, who's in charge?
No, I have not offered to resign.
Did you ever consider it?
No, I do not. I have not considered it.
No apology, no regrets from Dominic Cummings Monday, as Boris Johnson's top advisor refused to go over that 264-mile trip home to County Durham back in March in the north of the country. This was at the height of the lockdown in the UK. Even before coronavirus, the mastermind of the Brexit campaign already incarnated, you might say, that role of Britain's political bogeyman. And while the Prime Minister, who himself is on the mend from COVID-19, hunkered down and stood by Cummings in the face of outrage, Johnson has to quell a backbench revolt among Conservative MPs. They have constituents who've missed funerals during this lockdown period. They've long seethed as what they and the civil service sees as the outsized powers of unelected consultants. Why does Cummings seem irreplaceable to Johnson? The answer, well, is intertwined perhaps with the narrative spun since 2016. Of the people wanting to take back control, a term that was coined by Cummings. So is it unaccountable advisors versus elected officials in the civil service? For more hardcore populists, will this instead be seen as the people versus the deep state? Again, with public trust essential in any crisis, it's all about leadership and that trust. Today in the France 24 debate, Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings are in the spotlight. If you're going to talk about a political strategist, well, you call a political strategist. We're going to London. John McTiernan, who ran political operations for then Prime Minister Tony Blair from 2005 to 2007, who is a commentator and political strategist still today. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you.
Thanks for being with us. I want to thank as well, joining us from the UK capital, Catherine Haddon, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
We're also joined from Paris by Daily Telegraph and Sunday Telegraph reporter and columnist Anne-Elisabeth Moutet. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Yeah, we hope to be joined by Dr. John Ashton, former Regional Director of Public Health for North West England, who's in Liverpool. Little connection issues. We hope to have those settled. You can always join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter. The hashtag is F24Debate. Yeah, growing calls for Dominic Cummings to be ousted from Downing Street. Nonetheless, Boris Johnson and his inner circle hunkering down. Kathy Clifford has more.
Resigning over the government's handling of the Dominic Cummings scandal. Junior Minister Douglas Ross explained, "I have constituents who didn't get to say goodbye to loved ones, families who couldn't mourn together, people who didn't visit sick relatives because they followed the guidance of the government. I cannot in good faith tell them they were all wrong, and one senior advisor to the government was right." Many other MPs, including members of the ruling Conservative Party, have called for Cummings, the Prime Minister's closest aide, to resign or be fired, angered by Boris Johnson's defence of his actions. During a press conference on Monday, Cummings argued that his 260-mile car journey was necessary because of childcare issues, while both he and his wife were suffering from COVID symptoms. Quizzed about a further drive they took to a scenic castle, he said he had wanted to test his eyesight. A poll conducted after the press conference found 71% of Brits believe he broke lockdown rules, and 59% think he should resign.
It does feel double standards, so I think probably he should at least apologise.
What an excuse. Who can believe that? You've travelled 200 or whatever miles, and then you travelled so-called 30 miles to check your eyesight. What, in the castle? Barnard Castle? It's just a nonsense.
The government repledged its support to the man seen as Johnson's most influential strategist.
I think reasonable people will understand why he acted as he did. I think there are unique circumstances in every case.
The political scandal may well further dent Boris Johnson's popularity, already falling due to his handling of the COVID crisis.
Let me begin with you, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet. First of all, do you think that he broke the law?
he may not have broken the absolute letter of the law, although the dispositions that made it possible for him to say, the emergency, that was for an entirely different emergency about his child. But it's equivocating. He's totally broken the spirit of the law, and he's certainly broken the compact of trust between the government and a nation that by and large has abided by lockdown rules.
By and large has abided by lockdown rules. Catherine Haddon, are you surprised that he didn't resign?
In normal circumstances, you would expect a political scandal like this to lead to a resignation, particularly after so many days. And the polling that the government is now experiencing, a number of Conservative MPs complaining about this and calling for his resignation, and a lot of complaints from constituents to those Conservative MPs. But these aren't normal times, and this isn't a normal government. We've seen this before with both Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson, and the project that the two of them have been working on with a number of other people, that they don't want to do things the normal way, that they feel, for instance, in this case, that they can resist, that they've got different approach to how to do the communications around this, and that they know what the public in the long term want.
Yeah, we've seen even the conservative press has been very vocal. We could show you the front page of today's Daily Telegraph, the newspaper of Anne-Elisabeth Boutet. Tories revolt as voters turn on Cummings. The Daily Mail had the story on the front page. They've moved it now to page 4. Nonetheless, outrage of the Tory faithful runs the headline there. And still, you have Boris Johnson standing by Dominic Cummings.
I believe that in every respect he has acted responsibly and legally and with integrity, and with the overwhelming aim of stopping the spread of the virus and saving lives.
So it was interesting listening to what the Prime Minister had to say, because ultimately he is the man in charge, or is he, John McTiernan?
In the end, the Prime Minister is always the one who is in charge. They call the shots. Dominic is a very, very visible advisor, but I think over the last decade, we've seen the role of advisor being more focused on by the media and being more talked about in popular terms. And I think the Prime Minister understands that he himself cannot deliver the political leadership he wants to without the team around him. That's the way he's always operated in politics. It's unusual. Tony Blair had quite a changing team. I was the third political secretary that he had. He had 3 different heads of policy. He had a couple of different press secretaries. Normally, the staff can change, but the leader stays the same. In this case, it feels very strongly as though Boris Johnson does not believe that he can run the government he wants to run, deliver the mandate he believes he has, without this single advisor, which must be very confusing, maybe challenging for the members of the cabinet.
But John, you came in the 8th year of Tony Blair's reign as Prime Minister. Remember when he was first elected, his big political advisor was Alastair Campbell, the former journalist. At the time, he seemed irreplaceable, didn't he?
He did, but when Alastair became the story, as he said, he resigned, he left, and he was replaced by David Hill, a professional communications professional who'd been around as a Labour advisor from the Labour government in the 1970s. So a very seasoned person. That was the big ability of Tony. He actually found people to replace apparently irreplaceable figures. And it seems a weakness or a lack of imagination in the Prime Minister that he cannot find another person in a country of over 60 million people who can give him the same advice, same support. I mean, just through the link door in the Cabinet Office, he's got Michael Gove, who's probably, for my money, the best and most political and intellectually thoughtful of all of the Cabinet at the moment. So he actually has an elected politician, experienced elected politician, who could be giving him some of this support, which is normally the way, Blair and Brown. It normally works as a partnership between politicians in the UK, rather than a partnership between a politician and a single advisor.
A partnership between potential rivals. We saw it in past Conservative leadership contests.
Yeah.
It's interesting that John McTiernan mentions Michael Gove and Elisabeth Moutet, since Dominic Cummings worked for Michael Gove first.
Yes, and it's very interesting, but it also tells us something about Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is somebody who's actually very faithful to his inner circle, and once he trusts someone, he never wants to let go of them, even though Gove challenged him at the time, just after the Brexit vote, for the leadership, with the result that Theresa May became the leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And even that, which was called by many people in his own party a stab in the back, is not enough. Boris trusts the intelligence of Michael Gove, and he also trusts him to actually not be Machiavellian, which certainly you cannot levy at Dominic Cummings. But it's as if once he'd found a trusted circle, he found it very difficult to get rid of that trusted circle. And of course, politically, this is a complete disaster, because you need to be ruthless and you need to be thankless. And I can't help thinking of François Mitterrand, who threw away any number of people, including his last prime minister, Pierre Bérégovoy, when it did not suit him to have them politically around. What amazes me in this whole thing is how what a complete political hash they've made of it. It became a case.
But Elisabeth, remember back at the election in December, we said to ourselves, oh, we've got the veneer of nice guy Boris, but what we've seen in this campaign is that he's ruthless. Have you changed your mind? He's no longer ruthless?
No, I think he was ruthless because Dominic Cummings was behind him, moving the arms and the legs.
All right. A lot of questions on the hashtag F24 debate, including one from Fofi, who asks, why does the Prime Minister insist Dominic Cummings acted legally? Catherine Haddon.
So this is what we were referring to earlier on. You've got two different things. You've got the law about what you could do at that time, and then you've also got government guidance. And the accusation is obviously that he broke both. Now, with the law, it's quite vague about the purposes for which you can leave the house. Time, there was a lot of debate about an exercise more than once a day. There were a load of reasons for leaving the house that were set out in law. But then there was this test that you must have a reasonable excuse. And there were also provisions put in for various things, including, importantly, for safeguarding, particularly around domestic violence, so that people who did need to leave their house in an emergency when lives were, at stake would be able to do so. And one of the things that they've talked about is that what Dominic Cummings was doing was effectively safeguarding his own child by making sure that he had childcare in place. So that's their excuse in terms of the law. In terms of the guidance, it's trickier because, and certainly in terms of how the public are perceiving it, because the government said time and again, you must not leave, particularly if you have coronavirus symptoms. And that's the argument, is that he shouldn't have left at all, that he should have sought some kind of childcare support if needed in and around his local area. And remembering also, in the end, he didn't take up any of that childcare support. So a lot of people are arguing that it doesn't stack up from that point of view. So there's a question about whether or not...
And that drive, if I may, Catherine, that drive to visit a castle is certainly a killer.
Yeah, I mean, that's the trickiest thing for them to hold up. It's quite extraordinary because he says that he did that in order to test his eyesight, which it's not legal to drive in this country if your eyesight isn't working. So it doesn't really work as an excuse. But again, it's one of those things. Unless the police bring a case against him, this is all just a matter of conjecture and argument. And it is obviously a huge argument. The important thing is a lot of the public think that he broke the law and the guidance.
Yeah, and of course, John, I know the British aren't dumb. They know that when he says, I'm going for a ride to test my eyesight, he's effectively saying, go away, I can do whatever I want, right?
Yeah, I think the extraordinary thing about this incident is the most precious quality you can ever have as a political party or as a government is the feeling amongst the voters that you're on their side. On our side is desperately sought for as one of the most significant qualities of a government or a political party. And in one weekend, that's been thrown away by the government. The Tories, deliver Brexit. They got Britain out of the European Union. They won a majority because of Brexit. And they were seen by the public as being on their side, and they were committed to a radical agenda of levelling up in the north and taking growth out of London and all kinds of things which showed they were a different type of Tory party. And this weekend has shown, I don't care. One rule for me, a different rule for you guys. You know, you follow the rules, you must be a mug. And those kinds of things is corrosive. And you see it in the opinion poll, and maybe opinion polls will change, and maybe, but the question of the quality of respect.
John, let's look at opinion polls. When you look at that Daily Mail published that tracking poll this Wednesday, and you see Boris Johnson, did he lose it all in one weekend, as you say, John, or did he lose it, in fact, earlier than that? Remember, he catches COVID-19. Everybody in the UK is rooting for the Prime Minister to get better. And did he fail to capitalize on that moment to really bring the nation together with a message of unity?
Well, I think actually people were rooting for him. No one wants the Prime Minister to be in that situation, to be in intensive care, to be suffering those risks. I think the issue was he came out, and two things happened. I think there was a lack of energy from him, which is utterly understandable, that he wasn't fully fit, and he didn't accept or concede or say. There was a bit of, they never said how ill he was when he went into hospital. They never said until he came out how really ill he'd been. And afterwards, they've not been honest really about how slow the recovery has been. So a bit of a question mark was set there. But I think it was a moment at which you could have united the country, but instead, a bit more of the tone and feel of the referendum campaign, a bit more of the tone and the feel of the election campaign came out about trying to divide the country into Conservative supporters supporting the government, capitalizing politically for the party. And I think that was a misjudgment, because in a crisis, you get the instinctive support of the country. And if you wish to capitalize on it, deal with the crisis. Then later on, capitalize on that. But don't try to exploit the crisis to get some kind of division. And I think the problem with the Tory party, with the leadership, the number 10, the Johnson Cummings approach, is that by and large, it does want to bring not peace but a sword to most debates, and this hasn't been a moment for peacemakers, not a moment for conflict and disruptors. And I don't think they thought when they were opening this up they were doing anything other than capitalizing in the way they did. But it turns out that they have been disrupted by this, and their entire progress, their narrative, their story is now in tatters, I think, if you look at the polling.
Catherine Haddon, this goes beyond the UK. Our viewers are all around the world here. So, there's 2 points here that were made that we just heard. One, that crisis management involves transparency. Mm-hmm. And two, first you deal with the crisis, then you go back to politics. Is that possible, though?
It's very difficult, and it's going to be a huge challenge for this government. I mean, there's an additional point that crisis management involves leadership, and one of the challenges that Boris Johnson has had since the start is his absences. In the very early weeks of this, one of the criticisms made is that he wasn't there, that he didn't chair the all-important crisis management COBRA meeting until much later. And again, even this weekend, at first it was the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, who was sent out to give explanations about what was going on. So there's big questions also about his visible leadership and the degree to which he's sort of in front of the camera. But yes, transparency is another issue. We took a long time to get science advice clearly set out. It took a long time for the government to sort of explain what it might do about easing the lockdown. And even now, sort of explaining its rationale is really difficult. And this is just going to create more distrust amongst the public about what the government are doing and why.
All right, we're going to try to go to Liverpool, and Dr. John Ashton, who former head of public health for the northwest of England. Dr. Ashton, I know that the broadband gods are perhaps not with us, but you are. Can you hear us okay?
It's coming and going. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear. Your thoughts on how the government regains trust in its messaging over this crisis?
I think it's very difficult now. I think from the very beginning, they blew it. It was a combination, really, of the political side and the public health side itself. That the failure of the Prime Minister to convene and chair the Cobra Committee at the beginning of February meant that there was a failure to get a grip. And the second failure was the failure to commit to openness and transparency, which has gone all the way through this. This has been coupled with a dysfunctional public health system, which is a very embarrassing thing because the British public health system has historically always been very strong, but it suffered from 10 years of austerity and from the dysfunction that followed on from the massive reorganisation of the health service and of public health in 2013. And the failure to take the public with them, except in as much as the public, of course, wanted the government to be successful, has just now played out over the last few weeks as it's become apparent that we've really failed dismally to get to grips with the pandemic compared with other countries.
With other countries, it's true that the death rate right now is much higher in the UK. The infection rate, I think, is 10 times higher than it is today here in France, where we've just eased lockdown 10 days ago. Let me ask you, though, Dr. Ashton, what you're saying about a public health service that suffered years of cutbacks, that's not just unique to the United Kingdom. And in fact, Boris Johnson, when he ran in the last general election, said he was going to invest in the public health service.
Yeah, but they didn't. I mean, it would take longer than we've got to explain. But in 2013, we created this National Public Health Agency, Public Health England, which has centralised the public health function into London and the South East and has presided over the cut back in the local and regional public health system, so it wasn't able to be drawn on in the way it should have been in February and March for the testing and for the traditional public health functions that would have enabled us to get on top of all of this. So it was warm words from the Prime Minister. I mean, the public health teams at the local level are much smaller than they were 8 years ago, and the budgets are much smaller too. But what we've had throughout this has been political messaging instead of clear public health messaging. And the slogans, which have been political slogans, have not been helpful. I
was going to say that north-south divide that you mentioned, the fact that political messaging has come ahead of crisis management itself. Well, it all reverts back again to that special relationship that exists between the Prime Minister and the man who ran the campaign for Brexit back in 2016. Erna Gunke has more.
Do you have anything to say? Why are you guys not social distancing?
Little reaction from Dominic Cummings over the controversy surrounding his decision to break the UK's lockdown rules. Despite his calm composure, Cummings faces growing pressure to step down, both from the streets and from British political leaders. Even before the lockdown row, the 48-year-old was no stranger to controversy. A self-styled political disruptor, Cummings has long expressed disdain for public approval, the media, and even the civil service. Dominic Cummings has worked as a strategy advisor for Conservative leaders or campaigns since 2004. But he's perhaps best known for his role in some of the party's recent decisive political victories, giving him the reputation as one of Britain's most powerful men. Cummings was the head of the 2016 Vote Leave campaign to take Britain out of the European Union. His role was even dramatized in the 2019 British television film Brexit, the Uncivil War. While it was ultimately successful, under his leadership, the Vote Leave campaign broke electoral laws over spending limits. And Cummings was later held in contempt of Parliament for failing to respond to a summons to give evidence to a parliamentary committee. That didn't prevent Boris Johnson from appointing Cummings as his senior advisor, a role for which he is credited with helping get a Brexit deal through Parliament and orchestrating the Conservative Party's crucial victory in last December's elections. As of Monday, however, his supporters are few and far between. A growing number of opposition and Conservative MPs have called for him to resign, alongside several British newspapers and senior members of the Church of England.
More than 2 meters apart. Move out the way.
You saw the protesters outside his home there. Your reaction to that when you watched that report?
Well, look, when I was an advisor, I wouldn't have wanted to be mobbed. I wouldn't have wanted to have either protesters or the phalanxes of journalists out there. But this is definitely a classic of its kind. The way to deal with a crisis is to do immediately what you are dragged to do eventually. So if you don't want to resign, make a statement as soon as the story comes out. If the statement's made on the Friday, we're not talking about the handling for 3 days, and then we're not talking about the statement for the next 3 days. It is when you are as senior as the Prime Minister, obviously you carry the can for everything. When you're as senior as the most senior political advisor in number 10, you have to carry the can for your judgments and your actions. And so, as a human being, as a former advisor, I feel for Dominic Cummings and his family. But as a professional, you have to say, you pretty well brought all this on yourself. And that, just as they say in job interviews, you only get one chance to make a first impression. You really only get one chance to come clean. And the fact is, the first attempt to come clean about this was an article by his wife in The Spectator, the British political magazine, which has turned out to be full of holes and flaws when compared to the emerging stories, which themselves were finally corrected by Dominic Cummings at his press conference. And then that press conference has itself left trailing leads, as Kath said earlier on, that he appears to have used a clause in guidelines designed for victims of domestic violence for physical safety to excuse himself for traveling in a car with somebody who he suspects to have COVID. If you have COVID, you meant to stay in your home. So he should have stayed in his home if he thought his wife had COVID or was going to get COVID. And if you don't have COVID, you shouldn't be driving somewhere else because the guidelines were a lockdown. And so the core of this is a profound contradiction. And as ever with communications failures don't come from bad communication. They come from bad strategy, bad execution, bad operations, bad action.
So there's been a lot written about what's going on right now inside of Downing Street. Anne-Elisabeth Boutet, the Financial Times this Wednesday, quoting one anonymous source as saying that Dominic Cummings has been working hard to support the PM since he arrived at number 10. Another one saying Cummings is not a Tory, has no party allegiance, and does not rate anyone in the cabinet. Is he above them?
He's certainly not above them. He's a very bright person. He was brought in partly because he's a disruptor and he's proud of it. And you see the way he dresses, and that is not because he doesn't care. That is something that is part of the image. But the problem is that he also had great plans about changing things, and considering that every mature country, so to speak, has got a heavy civil service that could need a bit of reforming, it was not necessarily a bad idea at the beginning. But Cummings is somebody who I think relishes antagonizing people. And among the things he wanted to do was really not only to streamline the whole sort of British civil service, but he wanted to suppress some ministries. He wanted to merge others. And there's a strong cadre of mandarins, as they are known in Britain, who resented this tremendously and who it's now bunkerized on both sides. there's a great storyline within government that says this is the civil service hitting back and hitting below the belt, and this is a plot against us. And there's the attitude of the civil service that says this is a massive mistake, and there's no reason why this should not sort of come out. As, for instance, the fact that you've got statements by police chiefs which immediately contradict Dominic Cummings. This in a government that is not liked by its civil service. You know the story about the tweet 3 days ago which was suppressed by actually the Cabinet Office, which is the office of the entire cabinet, is one of the most powerful administrative bodies and political bodies in the government. And the tweet was, can you imagine what it's like to work with these truth twister, which is in a sense is we in the civil service are working with liars. And all of this is part of a narrative of embattlement on both sides. The civil service thinking they want to destroy us wantonly, and the Tories with Boris Johnson thinking the civil service is hitting back. And it is clouding their judgment. It is clouding their vision on how to handle such a crisis, because very often you have to do it straight away.
Catherine Haddon, Annelise Boutet touching on something essential. This goes beyond the judgment of Boris Johnson. It's about politics today. When you are adversarial, you get the clicks, you get the attention, and sometimes you get all the votes. She mentions this as being a case of the unelected advisors versus the politicians and the civil service. But can Dominic Cummings hang on and make this about the people versus the deep state, as some populists call it?
Yeah, it's difficult to know how they're going to go with this longer term in terms of the messaging. I mean, I think it's a bit more nuanced than you've set out. The civil servant, you know, Dominic Cummings is technically a temporary civil servant. That's the reason why he doesn't normally appear in public. His officials give their advice behind the scenes. Yes, there are probably some tensions, there are in every government, between senior advisors, these are politically appointed people, and the officials who then stay regardless of who's in charge. But I mean, in terms of the longer term messaging, it really depends what happens with public opinion. At the moment, it's obviously very negative towards the government. Whether or not that changes really depends on how the next few weeks of lockdown easing go. If the government don't manage to communicate that well, if it adds to more confusion, we've already had arguments about schools reopening, that could then create more negativity, and this loss of trust in this one episode, in this weekend, is going to be exacerbated. On the other hand,
but 5 years is a long time. Boris Johnson could rebound, right?
Absolutely. And the other thing that they might do is start to sort of talk about how this is detracting from the important thing, which is addressing coronavirus, and try and move the conversation back to some kind of national spirit, national efforts to try and get on top of this. And again, you know, to say they've already this weekend tried to say that this is the media who are politicizing this issue. And that they're, you know, hinting that they're therefore damaging the sort of effort towards coronavirus. At the moment, they can't fully do that because public opinion is right now against Dominic Cummings. But again, that might change over time.
Let me ask a geography question to John McTiernan. John, he goes to County Durham in the north, and that is important because back in December, it's where Dominic Cummings is from, but it's also back in December when the Tories win the general election, they win all those seats from those Labour constituencies. How is this going to play among those who deserted the Labour Party in the last general election?
I think there's a real problem for the government, which is that when you get a batch of new voters, particularly voters like these northeastern and northwestern and Durham working class voters, people who culturally and traditionally have voted Labour and felt very loyal to the Labour Party, and it took a big wrench for them to not vote for the Labour Party. When those people are detached by, you need to really woo them. A very big charm offensive is required. And the problem is, this isn't charming, it's just offensive. Because playing by the rules is one of the core things about ordinary, decent, hardworking people. You often hear this on the doorstep. You definitely hear it in focus groups. I play by the rules all my life, but what do I get? And so suddenly you see the play by the rules community see somebody not playing by the rules, and not secretly, well, actually secretly, but not successfully secretly. This is the challenge for the government. They actually had to have a 4 or 5 year program of delivering to the needs of people in these constituencies they won, on areas like welfare, on employment, on skills, on the social environment, on improving the quality of the towns, and in reviving industry or bringing new service industries to these areas. All of that, all of those actions are essential, and they're still, if you're politically wanting to get a Tory government re-elected, essential. The problem is you can have 1 million programs, but one symbol defeats 1 million programs, and what you have at the moment is a huge symbol. That's the reason why there's pressure amongst Conservative backbenchers that Dominic Cummings should go, because he is becoming both a symbol of a party that they don't want to be seen as, and also a lightning conductor for a lot of anger and rage. And the issue is, the political issue is, yes, it's a long time till the next election, but once you draw back the curtain, the public look at you, and they get an image of you, a clear image of you, that freezes. It takes.
All right, so the honeymoon is over, is what you're saying.
The honeymoon is over.
John Ashton, you're in Liverpool again. You're in the north, those areas where people deserted the Labour Party to vote Conservative in the last general election. Can Boris Johnson rebound among the constituents there? After all, he's got a newborn baby. He's still on the mend from COVID-19. Can he rebound?
Well, the geography point's very interesting. You know, I'm a northerner. I'm from Liverpool, but I was at medical not far from Durham. I know this whole area very well. And what this has done is to put the spotlight on Cummings' claims to speak for them. What it's done really is to demonstrate that he lives in a set of bubbles that ranges from the Westminster bubble. He's been at the Oxford bubble. The Durham is very much a private school bubble. And where he sought to go with his wife and family was a very privileged bit of the county of Durham. His claims to represent the common man, how they are, because he lives in a privileged bubble.
He lives in that privileged bubble. I'm going to interrupt you because the connection's a little spotty. But Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, you're often asked to come up to appear on French media to explain this super important point that we often don't get, which is the subtlety of class distinction in the UK and how it really does impact the way people put their trust in politicians.
Well, the interesting thing about this is that Boris Johnson is seen as a tough upper class, which he's not entirely, but let's not go into details. But and he was that sort of wonder, which was that he was somebody with a plumbing accent who went to the best schools and best universities, and still he was supposed to have the common touch and a sense of humor and a sense of what to say to people in the street, and a sort of bluff manner, aping in some ways the old Tory grandees, but it was cross-class. The appeal was cross-class, and you can see this in the Labour vote of last December and what was called the Red Wall in northern England, for whom those areas had voted Labour for years and years and years, but they could not stomach Jeremy Corbyn. And the one thing that Boris Johnson did very well, he went to the north the day after the election and he made a speech, and in that speech he said, I understand that for many of you, not only was it the first time that you ever voted Conservative, but it hurt you to do this. And we understand this. I understand this, and I know that I'm going to take care of you, and I'm responsible for this. I feel the onus on me to make good for the trust that you've put in me.
And you just heard John Ashton say, he's not really a northerner because Durham's a bubble.
Well, in so many ways, and it's a university town, many things, but and the whole class thing in Britain has been played in many ways, because you can argue that sociologically many Labour voters nowadays, just as it started under Margaret Thatcher, are less working class than lots of Tory voters. But the idea that you're mentioning, playing by the rules, and I think it's a very good point. It's all going back to a narrative of people who are detached from public opinion. It's, the toughs above us, the rules are not for them. It doesn't help that Dominic Cummings also went to a good school. It doesn't help that the rest of the government is giving a sort of mixed impression. But all this progress that was made, that was almost Thatcherian in the sociology, it's been damaged by this whole view. And the narrative of the elites, which is worldwide, is something that is very specific in Britain. Quite rightly, you mentioned class, and that's the moment when it's not helping. And it's going to be interesting to see how it's picked up by the current Labour leader, who, unlike the previous one, was very competent. And Keir Starmer has been giving Boris Johnson a hard time in Parliament at Prime Minister question time, and he's been Prime Minister questions, and he's right now he's got this plum sort of dropped on his lap. He's got to do almost nothing. His popularity has risen among Conservative voters. We were talking about this Mail poll, and he's now 3 points behind Boris Johnson at a time when Boris Johnson was 20 points ahead of Jeremy Corbyn.
Wow. So John McTiernan, forget what happened in December, forget the Brexit referendum. The slate is clean?
Look, yeah, I think Labour are back in the game. Competent leader. They've lost the bad image that went with that last leader. The Tories have gained a bad image, and the coronavirus, in many ways, in every country in the world, what it's done is it's shone a very harsh light on the flaws in the status quo. And the problem is, if you're in government when the flaws in the status quo are revealed, you quite often actually have to carry the can for them. You have to carry full responsibility for them. So now you've got a Labour Party which just in December, hardly any time ago in politics, got the most stunning defeat the party had since the 1930s. Looked like it might take 10 years to get back into the game. They're back in the game now. That doesn't mean anything's settled for the next period. It does mean British politics is really interesting again. It's not a done deal with this new government with their great mandate and their new seats and the new voters. We are going to have a government with damaged authority trying to deal with the deepest unemployment we've had since the 1980s, and no roadmap through this, requiring in a way to get the support of the opposition for some big decisions about restructuring the industries, restructuring sectors, moving out of this and cutting unemployment. So Labour were going to be influential, but I think this has really leveled the playing field.
All right. And it certainly will continue to be interesting in the UK. Many thanks, John McTiernan and Catherine Haddon, for being with us from London. I want to thank John Ashton for joining us from Liverpool, and Elisabeth Moutet here in Paris. And we want to thank you, as always, for being with us here in the France 24 debate. There's more on our website, france24.com, and our YouTube channel, where you can always subscribe. Bye for now.